Can the world be born anew? It is my pleasure to welcome the Honorable Bob Rae back to Studio 4 to tell us more. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to see you again.
Great to be here with you.
The only thing I always leave out of the introduction is that you were Richard Nixon's paper boy.
Yes, and also, you know, Rick Mercer's companion in the water.
I saw that. Very discreet, a memorable moment, and as I said to you in the green room, if this political gig doesn't work out, you and Rick Mercer can do a sitcom.
Well, I'd be glad to work with him again. I think he's terrific.
Mm-hmm. So, to more serious issues like democracy, government by the whole population. Good idea always, or sometimes not?
Well, good idea, yes, because it reflects, I think, our basic human values, our sense of what it means to be truly human and how we form political societies together, but not something you impose from the outside and not something whose growth and development is easy or automatic. And I think we've suffered a little bit in the last while from a kind of a naive view that, you know, we can simply go into a country and, you know, impose a constitution and impose democracy. And I think we're having to learn, as a result of what's happened in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, we're having to learn a lot of humility in the face of some of the intractable issues that we see. But is it universal? Look what's happened. Look what's happening this week. I mean, what's happened in Tunisia, what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in other places. There is a very strong human desire for freedom and for expression and for people's ability to be themselves. Thomas Jefferson, who lived the contradiction, slaveholder and theorist and philosopher of democracy, said, you know, at the time, American Revolution, French Revolution, said democracy is an infectious idea. It is infectious. I think we've seen the infection go from Tunisia to Egypt via the internet. What happens next? Who knows? Well,
in an age of WikiLeaks and blogging and tweeting, when a country can shut down cell phones and shut down the internet.
Not forever, though. You can shut it down for a while, but I mean, what's interesting is it was that great Canadian guru, who I'm sure you're in the business, so you know, Marshall McLuhan, who pointed out that these technologies have a real impact. We go from the printing press to television, radio to television, and now to the internet. It's having an impact, and you can shut it down for a bit, but you can't. It's very hard to stop it.
Anybody interested in foreign affairs, interested in world peace, probably didn't sleep so well last night, including President Barack Obama. And as you know, the United States, a great military power, but often weighs in on the side of the dictator. This time, trying to stay in the middle, saying we're not on either side. The protesters certainly want democracy, and we're for that. And we have a man who's run this country for 30 years, who's our friend.
Yeah, it's tough.
What to do?
Look, I mean, what to do? I mean, first of all, there's no simple answer. I mean, the Americans are not going to decide Egypt's fate. The fate of governance and democracy in Egypt will not be settled by the United States or the Soviet Union or any outside force. That isn't going to happen. What is going to happen is that Egyptian institutions themselves will ultimately determine the short-term course and the long-term course. You know, in the short term, there may be a period, there may be a return to stability, immediate stability. The army may reinforce things, but long-term, Egypt is kind of stuck halfway between modernity, parts of Egypt, very open society. You've got some very engaged, sophisticated business leaders. You've got great talent. It's a great civilization, an ancient civilization, very proud people. But at the same time, you've got, you know, 20–30% unemployment. You've got 50% of the country is under the age of 25. You've got all these kids who are out of work, and there's nothing that creates greater instability than a large out-of-work population. We saw that in Europe in the 20s and 30s, and we're seeing it in many parts of the Middle East. It is troubling, and we obviously have a great interest in it because we do have to be aware of the risks or the realities of extremism and how that relates to what's going on.
And as far as Egypt is concerned, our Arab ally, partially responsible for some stability in the Middle East.
Yes.
And if Mubarak is gone,
Well, he will go eventually. I mean,
Yes.
no
He may
one.
die. He's
Yeah, well,
old.
that happens. You know, I mean, none of us live forever, and I think this is one of the things that leaders have to come to terms with. Things don't last forever. At some point, people have to leave this mortal coil, whether they leave it, you know, voluntarily or whether they leave it some other way. So the trouble with Egypt, I mean, the thing that's made the system stuck is there hasn't been a consensus in the ruling party about transition. What is the transition? Who is the next leader? There's a lot of talk about Mr. Mubarak's son, talk about some other people, and then, frankly, a civil society that's growing that wants more transparency. Mr. Al-Bayadei coming in from having been away, coming back.
On the side of the protesters, he's a Nobel laureate.
Right.
Was with the United Nations as a nuclear watcher.
Right. Worked at the Atomic Energy Agency, very capable guy. But, you know, ultimately, we got to remember that King Farouk was deposed by Nasser in 1952 in the so-called Colonel's coup. The army has been playing a central role in Egypt since 1952. Mr. Sadat was an army general. Mubarak was an army general. The army will have something to say about what the future of the country looks like. But the army it can't govern without recognizing the force and pace of change. And military structures are deeply hierarchical by nature, and they have a hard time coping with the pace of tech change and the pace of the desire for greater openness and greater accountability. And that's a tension that we're seeing in many parts of the world, but we're certainly seeing it in the Middle East.
So as a foreign affairs critic, what should Canada's role be in this particular unrest in the Suez?
Well, we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that the people of Egypt are waiting for Canada to tell them what should be done. I mean, this is ludicrous. I mean, a lot of reporters ask me this. You know, what should Canada do? Well, what can Canada? All Canada can do is work with other countries and try to talk intelligently about the things that we know. We know that greater transparency and accountability and openness are good things in government, and they are increasingly seen as universal things that people aspire to. You can't turn off the internet forever. You can't turn off people's cell phones forever. You can't stop people from thinking and acting. And we also should be saying to the world, but we are also concerned and interested about stability. We think stability is something that's also an important human value that we take seriously, and particularly in this region we take seriously.
And we know when there's unrest in Tunisia, there are ramifications. Of course there are, but as North Americans, we support freedom, democracy, human rights, and rule of law. Generally, lofty goals.
Lofty goals, but hard to
export.
Frankly, very difficult, if not impossible, to export. Because it's so associated with other parts of our history that have happened, a whole imperial exercise that we went through for a couple of centuries, which proved to be very painful for the people who were experiencing it.
You mean revolutions are hard to keep at home?
No, I mean, well, that's true. The revolutionary idea can be hard, but let's face it, I mean, revolutions don't always end happily. The French Revolution didn't end happily. The American Revolution did, but a lot of other revolutions haven't. And so you've got to say, let's be a force for wisdom. Let's be a force for understanding, and let's be a force that talks intelligently about the need for engagement. One of the realities is Canada needs to up its game diplomatically as we look at what's happening in the Middle East. We've had, frankly, amateur hour on the Rito for the last few years. We haven't had a government that was prepared to really systematically engage at the highest level, at the United Nations and NATO and elsewhere. And that's the kind of government I think we need to see, and that's the kind of approach that we need to see to these
Well, the United
challenges.
Nations or the country sent a message when we weren't included.
Well, that's right.
William Fulbright is a man you quote in Exporting Democracy, and 40 years ago he questioned the ability of the USA or a Western nation to go into a small alien nation, undeveloped Asian nation, and impose democracy 40 years ago.
In Vietnam.
Yeah,
I mean, part of what I do in the book is look at the history of some of the debates that have gone on over the last several hundred years, but in our own lifetime. And I think we suffer a little bit from an excess of rhetoric. I mean, you know, you talked about in your introduction about the world being born anew. This is the classic phrase of Thomas Paine, which he used at the time of the American and French revolutions. And it's interesting how often that phrase has been repeated. Reagan used it in his inaugural address. President Obama used it in his inaugural address. And he's, Thomas Paine is a very frequently quoted guy in the American context. But everybody has to understand that the revolutionary idea has to be matched by a commitment to stability and the wisdom that comes with understanding some of the challenges that we face. Vietnam proved to be an impossible intervention because, frankly, because of the degree of corruption of the South Vietnamese government and the fact that it proved to be a completely unreliable partner for what the Americans were trying to do.
Right. So to get to the truth in any country, be it Afghanistan, Vietnam, Pakistan, Iraq, to find the truth is difficult.
It's difficult,
You've got tribal systems.
Right, but the world is smaller, and the world remains small. And if you look at Afghanistan, for example, I think it's very wrong to suggest that the people of Afghanistan, or significant numbers of people in Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan, aren't interested in freedom, aren't interested in democracy, and aren't interested in the rule of law.
And in education.
And in education. They are. They are desperately interested in these things. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, these places are really corrupt, there's nothing we can do, we should all just get out and go home. I actually don't agree with that. I think we have to remain engaged. I think the form of our engagement needs to be a lot more carefully framed, and we have to recognize that there really aren't military solutions to a lot of the problems that we think are military solutions.
If I remember correctly, you encouraged Prime Minister Harper to leave our troops there to train. And so that...
And remain engaged in education. And for us to remain engaged in looking at the security systems and the justice system in Afghanistan, and to look at health in Afghanistan, and economic development and social development in Afghanistan. I don't think that we can just walk away from the poorest and one of the most unstable countries in the world and one of the most unstable regions. I think we have to be more engaged with its neighbor Pakistan, which is a real challenge for the people of Pakistan and for us who watch that region. I think the whole region is one that has got a lot of instability attached to it. The one thing we've learned, and I think the one lesson that we have to learn from 9/11 is that this is a faraway place in some ways, but in another very important way, there are no faraway places in the world today. People move around so fast, technology brings us together so quickly that we can't afford to be ignorant about the security issues in places that we didn't know about a few while ago.
I think you coined it. Today, Canada is the world, and the world is in Canada.
That's right.
We'll come back with the Honourable Bob Rae.